On the evening of November 13th, 1974, Suffolk County's emergency services received a call at exactly 6:35 p.m. The shift had been uneventful, with only routine calls in a town where crime was a rarity. But that illusion of safety was violently ripped away. On the other end of the line, a frantic young man struggled to describe a scene so horrifying it defied belief. Minutes later, a patrol car pulled up to 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. Officer Kenneth Gaguski entered the house and moved up the stairs. Behind the first door he opened, the grim truth came to light: the bodies of Ronald and Louise DeFeo. But it was the next room that froze him. There, he found their sons, Mark and John, lying cold and lifeless in their beds. Shocked, the officer stumbled back down to the kitchen to call for backup. There, sitting at the kitchen table, was Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son. His face was covered in tears. Between gasping sobs, he muttered something that was pure nightmare fuel. His sisters were upstairs too. Backup arrived within minutes, and Officer Gaguski, joined by Officer Edwin Tyndall, made their way back upstairs. When they opened the next door, they found Dawn, 18, and Allison, 13, just as lifeless as the others. By 7 p.m., the house was swarming with officers, and word of the massacre had spread like wildfire. Neighbors and onlookers were gathered on the front lawn. Inside the house, Detective Gaspar Randazzo sat across from Ronald Jr. in the kitchen. The detective's voice was calm but firm as he asked the question on everyone's mind: who would do something like this? Ronald Jr. hesitated for a second before he spoke. Louis Fellini. He claimed Fellini was a mafia hitman with whom he'd had a bitter falling out some time ago. Detectives moved the interrogation to a makeshift command center in the house next door. Ronald Jr., or Butch, as he was known, seemed eager to cooperate, describing his movements the night before. Butch's story was elaborate, even including details about his family's dealings with Fellini. He mentioned hidden stashes of cash and gems in the basement, old grudges, and even an insurance scam involving a burned boat. When he was asked to retrace his movements before and after the murders, Butch offered an elaborate story. In the early hours of November 13th, around 4 a.m., he said he woke up, unable to sleep. He took a shower, trimmed his beard, and threw on jeans and work boots. Then he headed outside to his 1970 Buick Electra 225 and drove off into the darkness before dawn. But before leaving, he told police that he'd heard his brother in the bathroom at the time. He then claimed to have spent some time in Brooklyn before returning to Long Island to start his 6 a.m. shift at his grandfather's car dealership. Butch didn't stick around the office for long. When his father failed to show up at work, he made several calls home, all of which went unanswered. By noon, frustrated and bored, he decided to leave. He called his girlfriend, Sherry Klein, a flashy and popular 19-year-old waitress, and told her he'd stop by to see her. On his way to Amityville, Butch ran into his friend Bobby Kelsky and stopped for a quick chat. Then he continued on to Sherry's house, arriving around 1:30. He mentioned to her that he'd been trying to call home all morning, but no one was picking up despite all the cars being parked in the driveway. Even when he used her phone, the calls went unanswered. Although puzzled, Butch didn't seem overly concerned. Instead, he took Sherry shopping in Massapequa. Afterward, the two drove to Bobby's house. Butch repeated the same story he had told Sherry. His family seemed to be home, but no one was answering the phone. Both Sherry and Bobby were a little concerned, but eventually brushed it off. Before leaving, Butch asked Bobby if he planned to go out later, and Bobby told him he'd take a nap and head to Henry's bar around 6 p.m. He then spent the rest of the afternoon drinking and hanging out with friends, but the nagging worry about his family never left him. He arrived at Henry's bar at around 6, and Bobby showed up shortly after. Still worried, Butch mentioned again that no one was answering the phone at home, even joking that he might have to break a window to get inside. Bobby shrugged it off, and after a while, Butch decided to leave the bar. He had been having a bad feeling all day long, so he drove fast. Minutes later, he arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue and parked his car in the driveway. Immediately, he noticed that the house, usually full of life, was unnervingly quiet. He stepped inside, called out for anyone, but the silence was suffocating. Slowly, he made his way upstairs, and then the reality hit him like a cold slap to the face. Room by room, he found them. His entire family, lifeless, sprawled across the house in a way that felt like something out of a twisted nightmare. The nightmare wasn't just in his head anymore, it was his reality. He returned to the bar a few minutes later, screaming and begging for help. The bar erupted. Without hesitation, Bobby grabbed his coat, and together with a few others, they piled into Butch's car. They drove to the DeFeo house, and Bobby braced himself before heading upstairs, where he discovered the lifeless bodies of Ronald Sr. and his wife, Lois, in their bedroom. Both had been shot execution style. Staggering back outside, Bobby found Butch alone, looking distraught. Meanwhile, another friend, Joey Jesuit, who had been at the bar with Butch and Bobby and came with them in the car, found the kitchen phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, Officer Kenneth Gaguski arrived to find the group huddled on the front lawn, Butch sobbing uncontrollably before heading upstairs. Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, the detectives saw Butch as a helpful and cooperative witness. By the time they finished questioning him, around 3 a.m., they had no reason to suspect him. However, the feeling of reassurance began to fade as investigators dug deeper into the physical evidence. At around 2 a.m. on November 15th, Detective John Sherwell conducted a final search of the DeFeo family's bedrooms. The rooms where the murders had occurred had already been carefully examined, but Butch's room had not yet been thoroughly searched. As Sherwell scanned the room, his eyes fell on 2 empty boxes, the labels revealing their contents: Marlin rifles, 22 and 35 caliber. At the time, Sherwell had no way of knowing the murder weapon was a Marlin rifle, but he decided to hold on to the boxes, suspecting they might be important later, and they would prove to be. Shortly after arriving at the station with this new clue, Sherwell learned the exact weapon used in the murders. During a subsequent interrogation of Bobby Kelsky, Butch's friend, it became evident that Butch was a gun enthusiast. Bobby also revealed a robbery that the two had staged together to steal money from the car dealership where Butch was working. The detectives began to seriously consider the possibility that Butch was either playing them or knew more about the crime than he had let on. At 8:45 on November 15th, Detective George Harrison woke Butch. Expecting to hear news of a breakthrough, Butch's first question was about Fellini, the man he had accused of the murders. Instead, Detective Harrison read him his Miranda rights. Butch, protesting, waived his right to an attorney, seemingly eager to prove he was just an innocent witness with nothing to hide. Lieutenant Robert Dunn and Detective Dennis Rafferty took over the interrogation. Both were seasoned officers with decades of experience. Dunn, known for his steely determination, had handled high-profile cases with a no-nonsense approach, earning a reputation for his calm demeanor under pressure. Rafferty, on the other hand, was a bulldog of a detective. Relentless in his pursuit of the truth, he had a sharp mind that could read a suspect's every move. Less patient and more direct, the two quickly shifted the tone of the interrogation. Rafferty immediately began questioning Butch about his actions over the last 2 days, with a particular focus on the time of the murders. In his initial statement, Butch claimed he heard his brother in the bathroom during the early morning hours of November 13th, but Rafferty pressed him, pointing out that the victims had been found in their beds, in their pajamas, meaning the murders must have been committed in the middle of the night. Butch's story faltered, and he shifted his timeline, admitting that the murders might have occurred in the early hours of the morning. With that admission, his fabricated story began to unravel. The detectives, now fully aware of the inconsistencies between his testimony and the physical evidence, were closing in on him. Once the time of the murders was established, Butch's presence at the crime scene became undeniable. Desperate to get out of the situation, Butch maintained that while he had been in the house during the murders, he had only entered the bedrooms afterward, insisting he was not the killer. The detectives, however, were unconvinced. They had already found a .35 caliber gun in Butch's bedroom, and every victim had been shot with a .35. Butch's own weapon had been used. As he tried to weave a new story, claiming that Louis Fellini had awakened him at 3:30 and forced him to witness the murders, Butch's lies only further incriminated him. He described how Fellini and another man allegedly moved from room to room, killing his family members one by one. Butch was allowed to speak freely, and in doing so, he inadvertently revealed how he had collected and disposed of the evidence at the crime scene. The detectives, sensing a breakthrough, pressed Butch further. They asked why he had picked up the shell casing if he had no involvement in the murders, knowing that he hadn't been aware that his own gun had been used. Butch remained silent. The detectives, now armed with ample evidence, waited for him to crack. As soon as they had a plausible explanation for his actions, they struck. They suggested that Butch had been forced to participate in the killings. At first, he resisted, but eventually he took the bait. "I killed them," he told the detectives. In a moment of clarity, Butch admitted to the murders, explaining how everything had happened so quickly that once he started, he couldn't stop. It was over so fast, but the truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. The confession was just the beginning of a much more twisted tale. The darkness of night settled over the town of Amityville in the early hours of November 13th, 1974. Stray cats and dogs and the occasional passing car were the only signs of life in the sleepy neighborhood. But hatred and ferocity simmered beneath the apparent calm of the home at 112 Ocean Avenue. The town slept, unaware of the violence that was about to unfold. The entire DeFeo family was in their beds, except for Butch. Alone in the silence of his room, he knew what he had to do. His family, especially his father, had tormented him long enough. Tonight, it would end. Butch was the only one in the family with his own room. His violent tendencies and position as the oldest child had earned him that small luxury. It also gave him the privacy to collect a variety of weapons, some of which he sold. On the night of the murders, he chose a .35 caliber Marlin rifle from his collection and walked calmly toward his parents' room. He pushed open the door quietly, pausing for a moment to watch them sleep, oblivious to the horror that was about to hit them. Without hesitation, he raised the rifle to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. The first shot hit his father's back, tearing through his kidney and exiting his chest. Butch fired again, the bullet piercing Ronald Sr.'s spine and lodging in his neck. Lois DeFeo barely had time to react before the next shot rang out. Butch took aim and fired twice, the bullet shattering her ribcage and puncturing her right lung. Both bodies now lay motionless, the blood pooling beneath them. Though the shots were loud, no one else in the house woke. Butch surveyed the damage briefly before moving on. His next victims would be his two younger brothers, John and Mark. He entered their room and stood between their beds. Leaning over the sleeping boys, Butch fired one shot into each of them. The bullets tore through their bodies, rupturing organs and ending their lives. Mark didn't move, but John, his spine shattered, twitched in his final moments. The gunshots went unnoticed by the only surviving members of the family, his sisters, Dawn and Allison. He slipped into their room, where Allison jumped up just as Butch aimed the rifle at her face. One shot, and she was gone. Butch then turned the rifle on Dawn, literally taking the left side of her face with a single shot. It was just after 3 a.m., and in less than 15 minutes, Butch DeFeo had murdered every defenseless member of his family. Outside, the family dog Shaggy was tied up in the boathouse, barking furiously at the horror unfolding within. But nothing could distract Butch. Satisfied with what he had done, he turned his attention to covering his tracks, readying himself for the inevitable police investigation. He took a shower. Then he gathered his blood-stained clothes, rifle, and cartridges, wrapped them in a pillowcase, and headed to his 1970 Buick Electra. He threw the evidence inside and drove off in the early hours before dawn. He went to Brooklyn and dumped the pillowcase and its contents in a drain. Then he returned to Long Island and went to work at his grandfather's car dealership as usual. But to truly understand the darkness that would unfold, and what led to it, we need to step back to 1965. The story of the Amityville Horror begins with Ronald DeFeo Sr., a man who had achieved what many would consider the pinnacle of the American dream. After years of hard work at his father-in-law's car dealership, Ronald had finally accumulated enough wealth to leave his Brooklyn roots behind and move his family to a serene suburb on Long Island. The house he chose at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville was the embodiment of classic Americana. A 2-story home with a loft, multiple rooms, and even a boathouse along the Amityville River. Out front, a sign read Great Expectations, a name that seemed to encapsulate the promise of a fresh start for the DeFeo family. But behind the picturesque facade, the reality was far darker. Ronald Sr. was a man of explosive temper and harsh discipline, traits that cast a long shadow over the household. Arguments between him and his wife, Louise, were frequent and fiery. To his 5 children, he was a tyrant, demanding, controlling, and at times terrifying. The eldest of the children, Ronald Jr., born on September 26, 1951, bore the brunt of his father's wrath. Known to the family as Butch, he lived under the constant weight of his father's volatile expectations. One moment, his father might be embracing him. The next, he could be hurling him across the room in a fit of rage. Butch's childhood was marked by relentless bullying at school. Overweight and withdrawn, he became an easy target for cruel nicknames like Chubby and Pork Chop. At home, his father's advice to stand up for himself only served to underline the hypocrisy of a man who brooked no defiance from his own son. By the time Butch reached his teenage years, he had grown taller and stronger, which emboldened him to stand up to his father. Their arguments escalated into physical altercations, with father and son trading blows over trivial disputes. Ronald Sr., for all his bluster, began to see in his son a rage that even he could not control. Recognizing the severity of Butch's anger and aggression, the DeFeos turned to professional help, arranging for their son to see a psychiatrist. But Butch's sessions were fruitless. He was dismissive and uncooperative, unwilling to acknowledge that he needed help. Frustrated, the family shifted tactics, indulging their son's every whim in an effort to placate him. At 14, Butch received a $14,000 motorboat, a lavish gift for cruising the Amityville River. Money was never an issue for him, whether he asked for it or simply took it without permission. By 17, Butch had spiraled into a life of substance abuse and petty crime. Expelled from his parochial school, he began experimenting with drugs like heroin and LSD. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. On one occasion, while hunting with friends, Butch pointed a loaded shotgun at one of them, staring coldly as the boy's face drained of color. When the boy fled in terror, Butch calmly lowered the gun. Later that day, he approached the boy, feigning ignorance and asking why he had run off. At 18, Butch began working at his grandfather's car dealership, a job that came with little responsibility and even less oversight. Whether he showed up for work or not, he was guaranteed a paycheck, supplemented by generous handouts from his father. Butch used the money to fuel his escalating drug and alcohol habits, as well as to maintain his car, another gift from his indulgent parents. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Butch's relationship with his father reached a boiling point. Tensions flared when Butch concocted a plan to extort more money from the family, fabricating a robbery during a bank deposit. When Butch returned after a 2-hour delay, his story of the theft raised suspicions. His father, already suspicious, drew his own conclusions, and Butch's behavior only served to intensify the growing rift between them. As arguments escalated, one night, Butch snapped. Grabbing a shotgun from his room, he stormed downstairs, enraged by yet another heated altercation between his parents. Without warning, he pointed the gun at his father's face and screamed for him to leave his mother alone. The gun misfired, but in that moment, Butch's indifference to the near death of his own father sent a chilling signal to those who were witnessing his unraveling. The trial of Butch DeFeo began on October 14, 1975, nearly a year after the shocking murders. The responsibility of securing a conviction fell to Suffolk County Deputy District Attorney Gerard Sullivan, who had no intentions of letting DeFeo slip through his fingers. Despite the numerous confessions and the evidence that pointed directly to Butch, the rifle, the location of the discarded evidence, and his own admissions, Sullivan approached the case with unwavering determination. He studied DeFeo meticulously during the preliminary hearings, the jury selection, and throughout the trial. He watched how Butch carried himself, how he interacted with others, and how his lies flowed effortlessly. Sullivan was not deceived by the defendant's behavior. He recognized Butch for what he truly was, a manipulative, cold-blooded killer, and he was determined to make sure the jury saw the same thing. Butch hired famous defense lawyer William Weber, who tried to convince the jury that Butch was insane. However, Prosecutor Sullivan was sure Butch was not insane, but a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing. The trial came down to whether the defense could prove Butch was legally insane when he committed the murders. Sullivan worked tirelessly to present the most compelling case. He brought in numerous witnesses, police officers, relatives, and friends, all of whom painted a portrait of Butch for the jury. But the most telling testimony came from Butch himself. Weber called his client to the stand, attempting to portray him as a victim of mental illness. He showed Butch a photo of his murdered mother and asked him if he recognized her. Butch's response was chilling. He claimed he had never seen the woman in the photo and didn't know who she was. Then, Weber showed him a photo of his father's body, and Butch admitted to killing his parents, justifying the act as self-defense. The courtroom was stunned by Butch's blunt admission. The jurors reacted, some gasping in shock at his words. Sullivan, however, remained stone-faced, knowing this was just the beginning of his cross-examination. He swiftly moved to dismantle Butch's testimony, questioning his apparent inability to recognize his own mother, while reminding him of his prior confessions to the police. Sullivan's questions pressed Butch, aiming to expose the dangerous arrogance and calculated nature behind his actions. As the cross-examination deepened, Sullivan focused on the events of the murders. He pushed Butch to reveal his true feelings about what had happened. Butch's contradictory responses spoke volumes. When asked if he felt good after killing his family, Butch didn't hesitate. He admitted to feeling very good, but when pressed on the satisfaction of the killings, he couldn't explain why he had murdered them. His answers suggested a twisted sense of pride, even as he denied feeling any remorse. Sullivan's approach was methodical. He baited Butch, hoping to unmask the predatory killer beneath the facade of a confused, delusional man. The prosecutor's sharp questioning even led to a moment of blatant hostility from Butch, who threatened Sullivan's life from the witness stand. It was a glimpse of the violent rage that had lurked beneath the surface all along. Sullivan's work had set the stage. By the time the trial ended, the jury had seen a man who wasn't a victim of insanity, but a remorseless killer, ready to do anything to cover his tracks. The prosecution's strategy had worked. Butch DeFeo's true nature had been laid bare. As the trial continued, the question of Butch DeFeo's sanity became even more critical. Both sides brought in expert psychiatrists to support their arguments. The defense called upon Dr. Daniel Schwartz, a well-respected figure in the psychiatric community, who would later gain national attention for declaring son of Sam killer David Berkowitz insane. Sullivan knew the stakes had never been higher. He had to stay vigilant, especially with Schwartz taking the stand for the defense. Although he had enlisted his own expert psychiatrist to challenge Schwartz's conclusions, Sullivan understood that the true key to winning the case lay not just in expert testimony, but in his own ability to cross-examine with precision. By a stroke of luck, the defense handed Sullivan a perfect opening. Overconfident in Schwartz's reputation, Weber only asked a few questions before stepping back to allow the doctor to give a detailed explanation of psychosis and criminal insanity. The jurors seemed taken with Schwartz's professional demeanor and clinical analysis of Butch's actions the night of the murders. But Sullivan noticed something crucial. Schwartz had made several statements that, if challenged, could damage the defense's case. He smiled to himself, already formulating his strategy. Sullivan's cross-examination began with a subtle probe into Schwartz's experience as an expert witness, aiming to unsettle him with his thorough research. He then shifted gears, attacking Schwartz's analysis of Butch's behavior after the murders. Sullivan wasted no time, drawing attention to the actions that Schwartz had dismissed as insignificant. Sullivan argued that by removing evidence from the crime scene, Butch was deliberately trying to avoid being linked to the murders. Schwartz countered, suggesting that DeFeo's actions were not an attempt to hide the crime from others, but rather a reflection of a deeper psychological struggle. Butch was metaphorically trying to clean his hands, as if he couldn't live with the imagined blood on them, a concept Dr. Schwartz evoked by referencing Lady Macbeth's famous line from Shakespeare, alluding to the metaphor of guilt that can't be erased, no matter how much one tries. Sullivan wasn't buying it. He quickly pushed back, questioning the doctor's professional opinion. Schwartz, now defensive, insisted that DeFeo's actions didn't indicate a conscious effort to conceal the crime, pointing to the dead bodies as the ultimate evidence. But Sullivan pressed harder, unwilling to let Schwartz's interpretation stand. Sullivan pressed further, challenging the idea that removing the evidence linking Butch to the murders was insignificant. His frustration grew as Schwartz stuck to his position, responding with a nonchalant demeanor. Determined to dismantle the defense's argument, Sullivan wasn't about to let this moment pass without pushing back. Shifting tactics, Sullivan zeroed in on a key point in Schwartz's testimony, the fact that Butch had claimed to dispose of evidence to avoid helping the police. This, Sullivan knew, was a glaring contradiction to Schwartz's assertion that DeFeo was driven by neurotic delusions. Sullivan smiled triumphantly as he pointed out that Schwartz had previously claimed Butch acted without clear purpose due to neurotic delusions. He then highlighted how Butch's statement about not wanting to leave evidence for the police contradicted that idea. Caught off guard, Schwartz reluctantly acknowledged the point, but Sullivan pressed on, further emphasizing the significance of Butch's actions in removing the shell casings. Schwartz's frustration was palpable as he tried to salvage his position, but the damage had been done. Sullivan's cross-examination had exposed the contradictions in the defense's case. Sullivan, with a final victorious glance at Schwartz, declared that he had no further questions and returned to his seat, leaving the psychiatrist's testimony in shambles. Dr. Harold Zolan took the stand for the prosecution. Unlike the defense's approach with their expert witness, Sullivan's questioning of Dr. Zolan was meticulous and detailed. He skillfully led the doctor through a series of questions, making sure the jury could follow Zolan's reasoning and understand how the psychiatrist reached his conclusions. Zolan's notes were presented so that the jurors could trace his thought process and ultimately come to their own understanding of the diagnosis. Zolan testified that Butch DeFeo's behavior pointed to antisocial personality disorder. This disorder, as Zolan explained, is different from mental illness. People who suffer from antisocial personality disorder are fully aware of their actions, fully capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. What drives them, however, is an overwhelming sense of narcissism and arrogance. In simple terms, Butch knew exactly what he was doing when he killed his family. He wasn't motivated by mental illness, but by a deep, egotistical need to control and destroy. Through Zolan's testimony, Sullivan was able to present a clear and compelling case to the jury. Butch DeFeo was not insane. He was, in fact, a calculating and cold-blooded murderer, fully responsible for his actions on November 13, 1974. Following the expert testimonies, Sullivan called several more witnesses whose statements further bolstered the prosecution's case. Finally, it came time for the closing arguments. Both Weber and Sullivan presented their final thoughts, each laying out their version of the truth one last time. Then, on November 19, 1975, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate and return with a verdict when they had reached a decision. Sullivan remained cautiously optimistic, but he knew better than to assume a guilty verdict was guaranteed. He was proved right when the jury's first vote came back 10 in favor of conviction, with only 2 jurors still uncertain about DeFeo's mental state. After a thorough review of the defendant's transcripts, however, the jury reconvened and returned with a unanimous 12-0 vote. On Friday, November 21, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of involuntary manslaughter. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. After his conviction, DeFeo gave conflicting accounts of the murders, claiming his sister Dawn and an unknown assailant were responsible, while he only killed Dawn in self-defense. In 1990, he filed a motion to vacate his conviction, but his claims were debunked, with evidence showing his alibi and witnesses were fabricated. The judge denied his motion, finding his testimony to be false and inconsistent with the facts. DeFeo was held at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, with all of his appeals and parole requests being denied. On February 2, 2021, he was transferred to Albany Medical Center, where he died on March 12, 2021. The official cause of death has not been released to the public. Thanks so much to everyone who stuck around until the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more creepy tales. And if you've got any thoughts or theories, feel free to drop them in the comments. I love hearing what you think. See you in the next one.